History is not changed by a lack of information, but by the decisions made under pressure. There are words that, once spoken, can never be emptied of the meaning history forced into them, no matter how neutral they sound, no matter how technical they appear. Camp is one of those words, a short word, almost administrative. At first glance, it suggests nothing spectacular, nothing dramatic, nothing that should instinctively provoke fear. And yet behind it lies one of the darkest mental constructions ever created by man. In the beginning, this word did not mean death, it did not mean extermination. In the early years of the Nazi regime, camps were presented as an administrative solution, as an instrument of public order, as a temporary measure meant to stabilize society. They were described as detention spaces, as places of isolation for those deemed dangerous, unstable, or incompatible with the new direction of the German state. Everything was carefully formulated, calculated, cold. They did not speak about people. They spoke about elements. They did not speak about violence. They spoke about national security. And this change in language was the decisive moment. Because when a human being becomes a category, and a category becomes a problem, the next step no longer feels extreme. When reality is translated into administrative terms, conscience begins to withdraw. It no longer feels like a moral choice. It feels like a technical decision. Hitler and his inner circle did not begin with the idea of mass extermination. They began with control, with an obsession for order, with the belief that a society could be cleansed by removing harmful elements. Once that belief was accepted, everything changed. Because the moment you accept that a group of people is a problem to be solved, it is only a matter of time before the solution becomes radical. And no one, absolutely no one, stopped to say, this is the limit. There was no chaos. There was no visible madness. There was organization, method, efficiency. The camps were not created by isolated fanatics, but by educated people, by clerks, by engineers, by officers, by doctors, by lawyers. People who went home in the evening, who had families, children, routines. People who saw their work as a professional obligation, not as a crime. Decisions were not made in dark rooms, but in bright offices, in orderly meetings, where numbers were discussed, capacities calculated, deadlines optimized, reports were written, charts were drawn, flows were analyzed. The language was perfectly sterile. No one said, people will die. They said, capacity must be optimized. No one said, lives will be destroyed. They said, the process must be made more efficient. And in this cold, technical, almost corporate language, the idea of moral responsibility disappeared, because everyone handled only a small piece. One filled out a form, another approved a transport, another organized logistics, another signed an order. And each one could say, almost honestly, I am not responsible for the outcome. This was the true power of the Nazi system. Not cruelty, but the fragmentation of guilt. No one felt they were pulling the trigger. And when no one feels guilty, anything becomes possible. There is an invisible threshold in every system built on moral compromise, a point beyond which turning back is no longer an option. Not because alternatives disappear, but because accepting the truth would require courage no one has left. For the Nazi regime, that threshold was crossed the moment camps stopped being temporary solutions, when they were no longer exceptions justified by context, but a permanent part of the state. From that moment on, the questions changed. Legitimacy was no longer discussed. Stopping was no longer considered. Everything revolved around efficiency, organization, optimization. Processes were standardized. Resources calculated down to the last detail, time compressed, and what could not be explained was hidden, not through direct orders, but through habit. That is where the final rupture occurs. When a system begins to sustain itself, the people inside it no longer act morally, they act functionally. They no longer ask whether something is right or wrong, only whether it works. From that moment on, Hitler no longer needed to control anything in detail. The machine was already running, and its inertia was enough to keep it going. Those who maintained it did not see themselves as authors of a crime, but as executors, as anonymous cogs in a mechanism too vast to be stopped by one person. And here lies perhaps the most disturbing conclusion of all. Absolute evil does not require constant hatred. It does not require fanatics. It only requires people who do their jobs and stop asking questions. After the war, almost everyone said the same thing. I didn't know. I had no choice. And perhaps some of them were telling the truth, but not the whole truth, because there were moments, few, uncomfortable moments. Moments when someone could have said no, not with weapons, not through revolt, but simply by stopping, by not signing a document, by not putting people on a train, by not executing an order. But that small gesture had a price, and the price was high. It meant losing your job, your safety, possibly your life. And faced with that cost, most chose to move forward. Not because they were evil, but because they were afraid, because they were tired, because they had learned to obey. That is how the camps were built. Not only from hatred, but from silence, from obedience, from people who told themselves day after day that it was not their responsibility, from explanations repeated so often that they began to sound like truth. And that is why this lesson does not belong to the past. Because the real question is not what Hitler did. The real question is what happens to a person when, step by step, they are pushed to give up judgment, empathy, and responsibility. How many small compromises does it take before you no longer know when you cross the line? How many seemingly insignificant decisions before you become part of something monstrous? And most of all, if you had been there, not as a leader, not as a hero, but as an ordinary person, trapped inside a system that pressed down on you every day, would you have had the strength to say stop? Or would you have done what most did? Move forward, telling yourself it wasn't your fault. Because most of the time, history is not changed by those who commit evil. It is changed by those who choose not to stop it. And those choices are not made loudly. They are made in silence, under pressure, step by step.